So I'd like to offer a talk tonight, and I've been trying to think of ways to include within this talk tonight about the cat, because I just love this cat that's here. I call it Kiki. And it seemed this cat is kind of a magical cat. I was actually, Juni and I were wondering if there's actually 2 or 3 of the same cats, because it seems like wherever I go, I see it. And but then other people have been alive, but I saw it over there. I don't, this is like kind of like a magical cat, and it appears to be in many places. And anyways, Amber the cat. Yeah, very beautiful disposition. So I'll dedicate tonight's talk to Amber and to all beings. Yeah, she's kind of lucky that she gets to live in a meditation center and all these people giving a lot of love. And is it he or she? She? Amber? Don't know.
It's a she.
She, yeah. So anyways, I like that cat. So this is from Saraha. It says that within my body are all the sacred places of the world. Within my body are all the sacred places of the world, and the most profound pilgrimage that I can ever make is within my own body. The most profound pilgrimage I can ever make is within my own body. That goes quite well with this poetic phrase from the Buddha that within this fathom-long body with its thoughts and emotions lies our world. Its origin, its cessation, its pathway to freedom is found within this fathom-long body. And from Sarhab, within my body are all the sacred places of the world, and the most profound pilgrimage I can ever make is within my own body. Very beautiful. So I want to again just congratulate you all for another full day of practice. We're in the heart of the retreat, or maybe just slightly a little bit over the heart of the retreat, the center of the retreat. But definitely things have settled down since I last offered the talk on the hindrances and the practices, the factors of awakening to help support the steadying of the mind and heart. And I know from talking with many of you that no doubt there may still be some things going on, but there's also some sense of finding more rhythm in the retreat, more steadiness, and that will continue. And it's important in these times to really keep the practice within you. And it's easy as we get a little bit closer to start talking and this and that, and that may have an impact on your practice as far as the lessening of our concentration. That solitude is very supportive for the deepening of our practice. So may you hold it with preciousness. So we are practicing, and we are practicing in such a way that helps foster the support of insight. We can't make an insight happen, per se, by just willing it or wishing for it. But we know enough about practice that certain conditions help support it. When we cultivate the right conditions, the possibility of insight arises. And the foundation of these conditions is living with integrity, with virtue, not causing harm to ourselves or to others, the steadying and clarity of the mind and heart. These all help support insight. But we don't know. We don't know when it will happen. We can't make it happen. But yes, there's conditions to support it. And sometimes the very just letting go of that ambition, the letting go of that hope, the letting go of that expectation letting go of that desire, is a key ingredient for wisdom to arise. There's a famous story of Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant. He was a monk, and he had a type of a mind where he could memorize every single teaching that the Buddha taught. That's why when you read the canonical literature, at the beginning of each discourse and teaching, there's a first phrase, and it says, "Thus have I heard." That's Ananda. "Thus have I heard," and then goes on to tell about the sutta, the teaching. So Ananda was quite busy memorizing all of these texts, all of these teachings, I should say. Because actually the language of Pali is an oral language. It is not a written language. And so actually for the 500 years after the Buddha's death, these teachings were passed on orally from one generation to another, and then gradually they were transliterated. Since there is no Pali script, it was first transliterated into Ceylonese, Sri Lankan script, and passed on that way, the canonical literature. It's interesting to say, as a little footnote, that a couple of monks about 20, 30 years ago in Burma wondered, is it possible to actually, they hear these suttas, "Thus have I heard," and Ananda supposedly memorized everything, and they thought, is that really possible? Because it's quite large. And so these two monks took it on to memorize the entire Tipitaka, the 3 baskets of teachings of the Dharma, and they did accomplish the task. And a friend of mine who's a monk in Burma met one of them and asked him, "How long does it take for you to recite this?" And he said, I recite for 8 hours a day, and it takes me a month and a half, 6 weeks to complete. So it's kind of amazing. It's kind of the Olympic athletes of memorization, to memorize something that takes a month and a half to complete. So Ananda was kind of busy, doing all these things. And after the Buddha's death, he was to meet with 500 arahants, or fully enlightened beings. And Ananda was not yet enlightened. And he thought for this meeting he should get enlightened, because it'd be kind of embarrassing to not be enlightened amongst 500 fully enlightened beings. And so the pressure was on him, and he tried really hard to get enlightened. Sitting, walking, and so forth. And the story goes, it was getting later and later in the night. He's getting exhausted, and he's, like, he ain't going to be getting enlightened today. And the story goes, when he finally just said, "Oh well," and then as his head hit the pillow, he attained full enlightenment. So it's a kind of this like very unusual story of when you let go, things may arise. And it's just a beautiful teaching of sometimes our effort can be too strong, or it's too goal-oriented to get something, and that gets in the way of getting what you're hoping for. So it's a wonderful teaching to just be with things as they are. Tomorrow we're going to go into a very fluid meditation practice called open awareness, or choiceless awareness, and I'm very fond of this practice and I'll explain more about it tomorrow morning, but one of the aspects of this practice is as far as a guidance, is to grasp at nothing and resist nothing. What would it be like just to grasp at nothing and resist nothing? Just letting experience unfold one moment into the next. So we'll speak about that. And there's a beautiful quality to that, when the ceasing of the grasping, the ceasing of this aversion. Perhaps that's where freedom is to be found. Grasping at nothing and resisting nothing. So insights, they will arise of their own accord, sometimes through the letting go, sometimes through cultivating these conditions of living with virtues, the steadying of the mind, and the development gradually of wisdom. Juan Ramon Jimenez, a Spanish poet, has this little poem that I am very fond of that speaks about possibility. He says that I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing, and nothing happens. Just nothing, just silence, just waves. And then he goes on to say, nothing happens, or has everything happened? And now we stand in the new light. Nothing happens, or has everything happened? That moment where there's a rotation of consciousness, where all of a sudden I see so much more clearly what's here. There's an awakening, a knowing. More than just in the head, it's an experience. So we're listening and feeling and experiencing deeply of ourselves. So tonight I want to speak about the sense of self. Jen shared last night about impermanence and the possibility and the truth, the reality of impermanence. And these teachings, though, are woven in through the meditation guidance as well as through a lot of the teachings of the Dharma. And it comes from this second teaching that the Buddha taught, which is called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which is the teachings of non-self, as well as, of course, the teachings of dissatisfactoriness and of impermanence. These are called the three marks or characteristics of existence: dissatisfactoriness, impermanence, and the selfless nature of things. And for those of you that have studied with John Kabat-Zinn, he has a more modern day translation of these marks of existence. For dissatisfactoriness or suffering, he simply says shit happens. For impermanence, he says things change. And for the selfless nature of things, he says don't take it so personally. So that's maybe more of a contemporary way of this expression of these marks of existence. And, you know, for many of us, we can understand pretty well about dissatisfactoriness. I mean, it's here in life, as well as, of course, the beautiful joys. But there's no doubt that there's dissatisfactoriness, there's challenges. And, of course, the one thing that actually doesn't change is change, and the reality of the impermanent nature of things. So these two we may or may not like, but we can grasp some understanding about them. But this third mark of existence, of the selfless nature of things, this is more difficult for us to understand. For many, it is one of the most provocative teachings. Commonly, it gets kind of misunderstood, gets kind of mystified. I mean, no self. I mean, what are you talking about? Is there some type of enigma? Is there some type of what is this non-self? Because, what do you mean, not self? Because aren't I myself? And aren't you yourself? I mean, and if I'm not myself, then who am I? That's a very scary and maybe very liberating question. Who am I without my story? But it really rubs up against our Western orientation that is so based on individualism, on self. And of course, Descartes declared so many years ago, I think, therefore I am, kind of like a hallmark of Western civilization. I think, therefore I am. But the Dharma wants to question in a number of ways, where is this I to be found? Shared with you earlier, one of the teachings in the first foundation of mindfulness is called the 32 parts of the body meditation. And so is the self found in the head hair, or the body hair, the nails, the teeth, the skin? If it's found in the head hair, well, I ain't got much self left because it's all kind of gone at this point. Or is it in the flesh, the sinews, the bones, the bone marrow, kidneys, the heart, the liver, the diaphragm, the spleen, the lungs? Is it in the large intestine, the small intestine, the stomach, the feces, the brain? Is it in the bile, the phlegm, the pus, the blood, the sweat, the fat, the tears, the grease, saliva, the mucus, the oil of the joints, and the urine? Those are the 32 parts of the body. I thought you might wonder, what are the 32 parts of the body? Head, hair, body, hair, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bone, bone marrow, kidney, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, large intestine, small intestine, stomach, feces, brain, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, saliva, mucus, oil of the joints, and urine. Quite a package. I've been working with the 32 parts for many, many years. It's a very powerful practice of penetrating into the body. You look at these 5 parts. The first ones, head, hair, body, hair, nails, teeth, skin. When we look at people, besides clothes, we see here are the head, here are the bodies, toenails, fingernails, teeth, and skin. That's what we see. And in this particular practice, it begins to penetrate into the body, to demystify the body, to begin to break some of the spells of enchantment of the body. So when you think of head, hair, body, hair, nails, teeth, and skin, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, fussing with head hairs and body hairs and nails and teeth and skin. There's a lot of money. How many of us have got upset about the condition of our head hair, our body hair, our nails, and teeth, skin? Cutting it off, shaving it off, and it ain't supposed to grow over here, and as you get older, it starts growing in other places. And but then again, the Dharma says, what is head hair? How many of you have left getting your hair done and like, oh shit, I hate my haircut? But what is head hair? So from the Dharma point of view, head hair is thin, flexible shafts of hardened cells. And they protrude from the head. They're just these little shafts, little sticks, little thin shafts of hardened cells protruding from the head. And what is its use? Its use is actually for protection from ultraviolet light. And it also gives a sense of some thermal regulation to help keep us warm. That's what head hair is. Yet we have created a whole conceptual world around head hair, around body hair, around nails, around teeth, around skin. And this practice is beginning to penetrate into what it really is. And even though it's, of course, thin, flexible shafts of hardened cells, we can get pretty upset on what it looks like. When I was 13 years old, I was brought up in a Jewish family and I got a bar mitzvah. And on the evening of my bar mitzvah, I wanted to look good. I was 13. And I got some, it's called Brill cream. You might not have it here, but you know about Brill cream? Okay. So I wanted to look good, and I'm 13 and I don't know much better. I emptied the whole tube of Brill cream into my hair. It was an oily mess. You could have made French fries on my hair. And I was so ashamed and I was embarrassed, and I have to go, I'm in the bathroom, my hair's all like dripping with oil and trying to wash it with hand soap, and I got a tuxedo on because it's the bar mitzvah party, and oy vey. And head hair. So there's a whole story to it. This is my life, this is my personality, and yet, what is it? I was making such a big fuss over thin, flexible shafts of hardened cells protruding from the head that its real use is for keeping my head warm and protecting me from ultraviolet light. So it's a very interesting practice as far as where is this self to be found? Where is it to be found in any of these organs? And this is only 32 of many more parts of the body. And I know it's quite a list, and why these parts and why were they arranged in the way that they were arranged, there's not much commentarial information about that, but what we can say through many years of practicing with this is that these parts are gateways and doorways into all of the other parts of the body. But is the self to be found? If it's to be found in head here, well, ain't got much self left, I'll tell you that. Where is this to be found? So take these facts. The body makes a new stomach lining every 5 days. The body makes a new liver every 6 weeks. The body replaces new head hair every 2 to 5 years, except for me. The body replaces new eyebrows every 3 to 5 months. The body grows a new skin once a month. The body replaces with a new skeleton every 7 years. 50,000 of the cells in your body will die and be replaced with new cells, all while you listen to me read this sentence. Radioactive isotype studies show that the body replaces 98% of its atoms in less than 1 year. So in other words, at any given moment, the parts of the body are appearing and disappearing because they are atoms. And so if you think you are your physical body, which body are you talking about? The body you have today is not the same as it was yesterday. Where is the self to be found? And speaking about the self to be found, it's actually been, in the last 20, 25 years, there's been a lot of growing research on the human organism, and it's been found that we're actually about 10% human and about 90% microorganisms. We're a human biome. And it's very interesting, and there's actually very interesting enough in the ancient teachings of the Dharma, there's actually a whole teaching on what's called living with the many. The many meaning the microorganisms that live in the body. And so it's very interesting, where's we're only about 10% human. There's all these biomes, all these microorganisms, which is me. And of course, these microorganisms are helping, hopefully, to create some harmony for a duration of time until we die. But then, of course, they go to town eating what's left. It's really a very interesting, wonderful system of decomposition that, the body begins to eat of itself and melts back into the ecosystem. It's kind of an amazing design. My old teacher, Tungpulu Choya Kabaye Sero, is a Burmese forest monk. His name means the teacher from Ghost Mountain living in the forest. Quite a name. And I remember one year, many years ago, he gave 81 Dharma talks on the 81 different families of organisms that live in the body. So the understanding of the Dharma is not quite as accurate, of course, as the modern day understanding of human biomes. But it's interesting enough, as I said, that there was some teachings, there was some understanding about that the human body lives with other microorganisms, some organisms. And anyways, for 81 straight nights, Tungpulu Sero gave a Dharma talk on the 81 different organisms that live in the body. Some that live in the eye, some that live in the nose, some that live in the anus, some that live in the armpit. I mean, just like all over, 81 different places. And I was there for all 81 nights. And he always ended with kind of a poetic paragraph. And he wanted us to memorize it. So it's po aim poza poto ikanda go itudo itodan dinjan pi. And what that means in English is that these organisms that live in your body, this is the ending of every night after 81 nights of this. Every night this would be the ending. He say that these beings that live in your body, they eat of your body because they need nourishment. They're small and they eat some, and because they have digestive systems, they urinate and they defecate. And then they're not monks. They're not celibate. They get partners and they copulate, make love, and then they have little babies. And then gradually, as time goes on, those parents get old and then they die, and thus your body is a cemetery. And then he'd go on to the next group of parts. Who was this guy? He's like 80 years, this old monk talking about this body in this way. But I just love that. Living with the many. In the Buddha's brain, with a neuropsychologist and a neurologist, Rick Hansen and Richard Mendius, they write about that as far as science can see, it cannot be found in the brain a location where there is an I, a permanent entity. That instead of it's broken down into subsystems and sub-subsystems. It's an utter illusion, they say, of there being a unified type of self. I love what Daniel Siegel speaks about the self. He says, the self is a plural verb, not a singular noun. And I like that it's in movement, it's moving. It's a plural verb, not a singular noun. That's actually kind of hopeful that we can make some changes. Yet again, this teaching of non-self, it may rub us against our status, our roles, our ethnicity, our culture. This really kind of rubs up the sense of narcissism, of egocentricity. Of course, for many of us in the Western world, it's downright not Western. And it's kind of mysterious. Or is it? The Buddha reasoned in this teaching of the marks of existence, particularly around anatta, which is the teachings of the selfless nature of things, saying that if there was a self, then perhaps you could say, self, don't age, don't get sick, don't die. And if there's a self, I could say, self, don't have your head hair go out. Or self, on March 28th, just last March 28th, I had to have a prostate surgery due to enlargement that was blocking my urine flow. I did not have a cancer, but I had a very large prostate, and they had to vaporize part of it to create more urine flow. Now, I did not send a text to my prostate gland to get larger. It just did it by itself. It did not ask my permission, because if it asked my permission, I would say, no, prostate, I want you to stay right the way you are. And so again, there's a certain sense that we do not have much control over this body and what happens to it. Last year, I had a synovial fluid cyst in my lumbar spine that was strangulating my sciatic nerve and causing tremendous pain down my leg. I did not send an email to that area of the body saying to grow a synovial fluid cyst. It just did it by itself. Fortunately, I had a very wonderful physician that was very skilled with going with an injection into my cyst and draining it, and he took 5 different times to do that, and I'm much better now. So this body just does what it does. And we don't have much control over it. And I love that actually even in our Western literature, there's references about the self or no self. Like Emily Dickinson, she writes, I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, but don't tell. They'd banish us, you know. But oh, how dreary to be somebody. How public like a frog to tell your name the livelong day to an admiring bog. Oh my. And then, of course, Alice in Wonderland, she says that one day the caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence, and at last the caterpillar took the hookah, its pipe out of its mouth, and addressed her in a languid and sleepy voice. "Who are you?" The caterpillar asked Alice. "Who are you?" Alice realized this was not an encouraging opening for a conversation, and Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then." "What do you mean?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." And Alice said, "I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself, you see." I love it. Even Alice knew about the non-self. I'm not myself, you see. But these type of practices can kind of shake us up. I have a friend of mine that's a psychiatrist, and he took a day long with me on the 32 parts of the body meditation, and that night he sent me an email thanking me for the day, but then saying it was a really just abusive experience. And to be very honest, I didn't know what the word disabusive meant, and I got scared. I know that abusive was in there, and I began to wonder, was my psychiatrist friend feeling that I'm abusing him? And so I looked it up in the dictionary, and actually disabusive is a beautiful translation. Disabusive is like you have this orientation about what you think the world is, and then it's turned kind of upside down. It's like your orientation, your settings, your bearings get kind of shaken up. And in some ways, these practices kind of shake up our bearings. I mean, who am I without my story? That's a scary and liberating question. So that sometimes some parts of this practice is kind of shaking some things up. What appeared to be so solid may not be so solid. Getting hot, getting cold. One thing that I find very wonderful that points to perhaps gaining some more understanding of what is the Dharma teaching about this non-self or the selfless nature of things. When said that the Buddha experienced the unconditioned. This is a very beautiful, what's sometimes known as the Buddha's lion's roar, the roar of awakening. He says, "Through many a birth I wandered in samsara." Samsara is the wheel of birth, old age, disease, and death. "And seeking but not finding the builder of the house. And sorrowful it is to be born again and again. O house builder, thou art now seen. Thou shalt not build no house again. All the rafters are broken, the ridge poles are shattered. My mind has attained the unconditioned. Achieved is the end of craving and ignorance. Achieved is nibbana. My mind has attained the unconditioned." And that's a very important thing that I want to share, because when it's said that attain the unconditioned, it's implying in order to have an unconditioned, you have to have a condition. And to me, this is some of the heart of what the teachings of non-self really mean, and it's coming from a more psychological standpoint. And I don't often hear it taught in this way too much, but to me, personally, it makes the most sense. To me, what the Buddha saw when he experienced the unconditioned is seeing through the conditions, the stories, the narratives that separated me from myself, to the universe, that separated me from discovering that happiness can be found within. So I'd like to share some about this, because this is a very important practice. When it's said that the Buddha experiences unconditioned, it's breaking free of greed and hatred and ignorance. When we are born, sometimes people may say that, we come in when we're born with certain attributes or things, and some people even have birth theories about how you're going down the canal upon your birth. Some of us are fighting our way because, whoa, this is too much, or some of us just succumb. It's oh, this is too much. And who knows what type of impressions, even though some of us might say there's not consciousness or aware consciousness, but there's some types of impressions that are happening in utero, perhaps in our mother's womb, and then the birth experience coming out. And then that incredible moment when our cord is cut and we become separate from our mother. And in these early years, in our development, with our personality, we're very impressionable to those that we are closest around, with our family, caregivers, early years of school. And we develop this sense of self, this sense of identity. And this identity is built and based upon our experiences of our life. And depending on these experiences, we may grow up to feel more confident. Other experiences, we may grow up to feel not confident. The messages that we receive early in life are very powerful. They're not always the case that you will be imprisoned fully by them, but for some we may. And I remember once Jen and I, in a retreat we were doing in New Zealand, and we were speaking with a woman whose mother, her memories with her mother was, "I wish I never had you." It's a horrible thing to grow up with an environment where I wish I never had you. And how that we can begin to, we don't know any better at these early and impressionable ages. We begin to seal our sense of our identity. Fortunately, with this particular woman, when we were working with her, and she's deeply working within herself, she had an insight that she shared with us about, in her professional career, she had been a nurse midwife and helped to give birth to many, many babies through her professional career. And again, to get in touch with, maybe I am all right. This is the beginning, and she'd been working on herself for some time, but really discovering once again one's own worthiness. So I want to say that growing up in this development of our personality, we've been smashed at times and made to feel small. And there's reasons for that because of what's happened. And to me, the teachings of the Dharma is to begin to see through these stories that we have identified with, that we've become so enslaved with and held hostage by, and to begin to see through these stories and potentially experience more freedom than we ever could have imagined. We cannot bypass these stories. This is part of ourselves and our personality, and our practice is to embrace and to become aware of these stories, and perhaps to begin to see that some of them is not as solid as what once appeared to be. A friend of ours, he had a rough childhood. His mother committed suicide. His father was a military commander and had few boys, and they were all very tall and kind of clumsy growing up, and it was a difficult time. And our friend in particular was pretty clumsy. He'd just knock over stuff and in the house and everything. And anyways, the father would get irritated with him, and he gave him a nickname. And you might have heard of a children's story called King Midas, and everything you touch turns to gold. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah. Well, his nickname was King Minos. Everything you touch breaks. It's like a kick in the stomach, isn't it? Imagine being called as a kid King Minos. Everything you touch breaks. So we've all had some type of conditioning where we hopefully have had more conditioning of helping to build our confidence, but there's been times, no doubt for many of us, where our confidence has been challenged and we've been shamed and made to feel small. Growing up, I had an Uncle Sidney, and he used to make a joke because I love peanuts, and I'd go to my grandma's house, and she'd offer, she'd have some bowls of peanuts on the table, and often when I'd come there, I'd say hi to everyone, I'd go over to the peanuts. And my Uncle Sidney began to notice that pattern. And maybe he wasn't aware, well, I don't think he was aware, but he would begin to make this announcement because he thought it was funny to himself. And so he would make an announcement to everyone here as I came in the room. Here comes the claw, like an animal claw. Here comes the claw. And I have fingers, I don't have claws. But more than that, it wasn't much the words. It was how he said it and how he brought attention to me. I felt humiliation. I felt shame. I wanted to just disappear. I did not want to be there. Gradually in time, I didn't go get peanuts anymore. I just didn't want this to happen. In our lives, there's times where we have been shamed, made to feel small, taken away our dignity. John Kabat-Zinn and his wife Mila wrote an incredibly beautiful book about parenting. It's called Everyday Blessings, The Art of Mindful Parenting. And in it, they speak about 3 incredibly important principles in raising children, and I just love it. And one is acceptance, the other is empathy, and the third, at first, to me, was a little, I didn't know quite what they meant, and they call it sovereignty. And so then when I read more about this, it's such a beautiful quality that, like when we're with our children, how do we honor their sovereign nature and to help nourish it rather than shaming and blaming? You know, when you look at young infants, they are just, maybe why we love them so much, they are just so full of themselves, and they don't really care at all what you think of them. You could have a baby sitting right next to me here, and it'll just make a big poop right here, diarrhea going from the hips down to the legs, and it could care less what you think. Or it could let out some farts, or go pee, or throw up at you, and it just starts out laughing and crying, and just like babies just being baby. That's just what baby does. And they don't have yet that feeling of being shamed, of being small, that this is not okay. That comes later. We do our best to try to help our children along, but how do we help them with their sovereignty? For many of us, our sovereignty has been smashed at times, some more so than others, just smashed. There can be amazing emotional cruelty and physical cruelty. We come into this world and this is the body that we get. Of course, in our culture, we're wishing we had another body. And like it starts early, this comparison. And all this stuff, this is why like the 32 parts is breaking through this enchantment, this spell of enchantment that we get hypnotized in and believe to be so true, and Geik is so personal, and it creates these tremendous feelings of unworthiness, shame, and so forth. See, in our life, there's been a lot of conditioning to develop who it is that we are. And no doubt for many of us, some of it has been very positive. Some of it perhaps has been very painful, a sense of shame. Does anybody acknowledge that you have shame? I'm going to put up 2 hands. Yeah. Look around, it's human, because shame in particular is one that we don't like to share. We want to keep it hidden. We don't want anyone to know. I don't even want to know. Never mind, I don't want anyone else to know. So important in our healing to reconcile, to heal, and perhaps in times to begin to see through these stories that I have so deeply identified with as I, me, and my, and see perhaps there's more there. That identification does not have to be so solid. I've come to look at my fingers and not to see them as claws, but as useful instruments that help me in so many ways. My friend that was told King Midas, everything you touch breaks, not only did he become a very successful business person, but much more important, has an incredible heart of wisdom and compassion. And so we can heal. We can heal. But we can't bypass these stories that we've all have in our lives. They cannot. This is called the spiritual psychological bypass. We cannot bypass these. But this is the very material we sit with and work with to transform our hearts. It's through mindfulness that we can become more free. And these stories that we tell ourselves, they're everywhere. I remember once in an MBSR class, it was maybe week 4 or 5 or 6, we were into it quite a bit, and there was a good rapport that was growing and a sense of trust and safety. And I remember one night we were just going around the circle and people were sharing some things, and one woman, an elderly woman, said, and I wouldn't expect this to come out of her mouth, but she said, I realized last week that I cannot remember one single day in my entire adult life where I didn't call myself an asshole. And then another person said, well, I don't call myself an asshole, but I call myself a dummy. And another person said, well, I call myself this and that. And it was like unbelievable going around that circle, like things that you wouldn't say it to anybody else because you wouldn't have any friends. But we say it to ourselves all the time. I'm ugly, I'm stupid, I can't sing, I'm not pretty, I'm not smart, I'm not this, I'm not that. These messages of self-loathing that continue to feed upon itself. And this is where, to me, the gift of mindfulness is a miracle, because it can help us to see these stories that we tell ourselves and begin to see through them. But that's not all of me. That's the liberation of mindfulness. And if not, we get very paranoid. We get very paranoid with these stories about myself. I'm going to read to you an incredible paranoid story. It's a little bit humorous, but it's enough humorous and enough real. It's like, oh, I could be that person too. But it's called, "We who are your closest friends feel the time has come to tell you that every Thursday we have a meeting to devise ways to keep you in perpetual uncertainty, frustration, discontent, and torture by neither loving you as much as you want nor cutting you adrift. Your analyst is in on it, plus your boyfriend and your ex-husband. And we pledged to disappoint you as long as you need us. In announcing our association, we realized we placed in your hands a possible antidote against uncertainty. But since our Thursday nights have brought us to a community of great purpose, rare in itself, with you as the natural center, we feel hopeful you will continue to make unreasonable demands for affection, if not as a consequence of your disastrous personality, then at least for the good of the collective." We can relate to that. It's a conspiracy. We get into those paranoid moments. It touches upon the deeper moments where we have been shamed, where we found people talking about us our feelings getting hurt. We begin to believe in our own deficiency and inadequacy, our unworthiness, our shame, our humiliation. These are great pains in our lives. But we want to try to be open, to see from another perspective. And it's good to remind ourselves to be open to see from another perspective. Because sometimes we can be so certain on the way that we see things that we don't see any other way. So here's another reading about this. A woman was waiting at an airport one night with several long hours before her flight. And she hunted for a book in the airport shop and bought a bag of cookies and found a place to drop. She was engrossed in her book, but happened to see that beside her, as bold as could be, there was a man that grabbed a cookie or two from the bag between, which she tried to ignore to avoid a scene. She munched cookies and watched the clock as this man, the gutsy cookie thief, diminished her stock. She was getting more irritated as the minutes ticked by, thinking if I wasn't so nice, I'd blacken his eye. With each cookie she took, he took one too. And when there was only one left, she wondered what he'd do. With a smile on his face and a nervous laugh, he took the last cookie and he broke it in half. He offered her half as he ate the other. She snatched it from him and thought, oh, brother, this guy has some nerve and he's also rude, and why, he didn't even show any gratitude. She had never known when she had been so galled, and sighed with relief when her flight was called. She gathered her belongings and headed for the gate, refusing to look back at that thieving ingrate. She boarded the plane and sank in her seat, and then she sought her book, which was almost complete. And she reached in her baggage, and she gasped with surprise, for there was her bag of cookies in front of her eyes. If mine are here, she moaned with despair, then the others were his, and he was trying to share with me. Too late to apologize, she realized with grief that she was the rude one, the ingrate, and the thief. So much for our perceptions of things, how we can think this is what's there. So our practice of mindfulness is begin to have a broader way of seeing, to see more clearly. And Margaret Wiltley, she writes this, and I think this is very beautiful. She goes, I know that we notice what we notice because of who we are. And we create ourselves by what we choose to notice. And once this work of self-authorship has begun, we inhabit the world we have created. We have self-sealed. And then we don't notice anything except those things that confirm what we already think about who we already are. When we succeed in moving outside of our normal processes of self-reference and can begin to look upon ourselves with self-awareness, then we have a chance at changing. We can break the seal. We can notice something new. So this is our practice. When we succeed in moving outside of our normal processes of self-reference and can begin to look upon ourselves with self-awareness, that's where we can begin to make the change. That self-referencing is that narrative, that dialogue that's going on and on and on. And we cannot bypass it. This needs to be befriended with great love. These wounds, with great wisdom, befriending our hearts, befriending these, understanding these stories so that we can begin to become more free of them, less enslaved by them. I love what Miller Williams writes here about compassion. It's for ourselves and for others. And he speaks about others in this way. He says, have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. And what seems to be conceit or bad manners or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard and no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on way down there where the spirit meets the bones, where no eyes have seen and no ears have heard. Have compassion. This is the big work that we're talking about. Compassion for others, compassion for ourselves. Carl Jung writes, I can feed the hungry, I can forgive an insult, I can love my enemies. These are great virtues. But what if I should discover that the poorest of the beggars, the most impudent of the offenders, are all within me? And that I stand in the need of the alms of my own kindness. That I myself am the enemy who must be loved. That I stand in the need of the alms of my own kindness. That I myself am the enemy who must be loved. So this is the task before us. It's not easy to let go of ourselves, but perhaps we can begin to get to know ourselves. And with this knowing and with this wisdom growing, just as the Buddha saw through the conditions, the narratives, the stories that enslaved the heart, began to have a glimpse about the causes of suffering and its endings. That happiness could be found within. So Dorothy Hunt, she writes, no matter how many words arise in your mind, or how many places its musings travel, no matter how many thoughts or opinions it clings to, or how many attachments to how many stories, no matter how many shoots called projections or memories, or how many judgments it imagines are true, there is one single tendril wound around all the others, and this must be unwound if you want to be free. The last one to drop is the one you most cherish, the one that insists its productions are real, the tendril that causes all of your suffering, the one that holds tightly to a thought called me. So let's just sit for a few minutes. So my teacher, Tongpu Lucero, used to teach this very short meditation. It's like a contemplation. He says, if you want to experience a brief enlightenment, a brief peace, practice this. So in these few breaths, as we breathe in and out, experiencing what it's like, that any wanting of anything else just dissolves, and what's left in its place is the richness of contentment that money could never buy, the falling away of any wantings for this few moments. What rises in its place is a sense of contentment and ease, because it's also intertwined without having any aversion to anything. So just in this moment, the wanting begins to dissolve, the not wanting begins to dissolve, and in its place, contentment and ease and the open heart. Breathing in and out, no greed. Breathing in and out, no hatred. In its place, contentment in the open heart. Just experiencing here and now, becoming free in these moments of the wanting and the not wanting. And with this understanding that happiness in these moments is a contentment, it's with the dissolving of this wanting and not wanting, the clarity of the mind arises, the heart, understanding. In these moments, with clarity, with contentment, with an open heart, are the qualities of awakening, of peace. We can experience here and now. Contentment and ease, the open heart, the clarity of mind, being with peace. So I'd like to end with a beautiful teaching from a Tibetan teacher. It feels very appropriate in this Tibetan center. The teacher's name is Tsongkhapa. It says that the human body, at peace with itself, is more precious than the rarest of gems. Cherish your body. It is yours this one time only. The human form is one with difficulty, and it is easy to lose. All worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. This life, you must know, is like a tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. The human body, at peace with itself, is more precious than the rarest of gems. May all beings discover the gateways into the heart, May there be peace. So thank you very much. And time for some walking practice, or if you want to just continue sitting, and just may you just walk with some tenderness in your heart, befriending these parts of ourselves that we have pushed away. In time, perhaps beginning to see through these stories and making peace. So thank you.